Welcome back to this lecture number 19, which is the last lecture in this series and the last lecture in this course on consumer psychology. There will be one more lecture that will follow this lecture, where what I will do is I will review what we have done over the 19 lectures, including this one. Now, in this lecture what I am going to do is I am going to complete where we left off in lecture number 18, when we are looking at what is marketing communication and what is the need of marketing communication. Further on, we are also looking at various aspects of marketing communication. Now, to brief a little bit of what we have done in this 18 lectures, previous lectures, we started off by looking at what is consumer behavior, defining types of consumers, and looking at something called what a product is, and then looking at how to do consumer research. Then we moved on to the idea of what is decision making of the consumer. So, how does the consumer actually make decisions? So, that is what we took on next, and we followed a famous model of consumer decision making, which is called the Blackwell model of consumer decision making. So, there what we did was we focused on something called information acquisition. Now, even before information acquisition, we focused on need recognition, which is the first step in any decision making process. So, we looked at the variables which affects need recognition of consumers. How is the need recognized, and why this is necessary is because if the consumer has no need, if he doesn't has a drive to interact into the marketplace, he will probably not make any behavior as such. So, there has to be a stimulus to start a behavior, and the stimulus in this case is the need recognition. So, we looked at what is need recognition and how does this need recognition is perceived. Now, once a need is recognized, we also looked at how does the consumer search for information, and following that we looked at once the consumer has an information about what he wants into the marketplace or from the marketplace, how does he do something called alternate evaluation. Now, there are a host of things, host of products which are available in the marketplace, and what the consumer has to do is to focus on these products, do an alternate evaluation. So, based on his need, he decides what kind of product he is looking forward for, and based on the information he narrows down a number of products which can serve the need that has aroused in him for the product or the service. And then there is a process of alternate evaluation, which basically means that the consumer compares a number of products which are available, which offers similar kind of benefits to him. So, we discussed that process of how the consumer does this evaluation, and then we focused on something called the final choice process. So, how does the consumer choose the final product, and we looked at several models of choice, the compensatory, non-compensatory, and so on and so forth. And finally, we focused on something called process of post-purchase evaluation. So, in post-purchase evaluation, what we did was we looked at once the consumer has a product and he knows that he is satisfied with it, how does he use the product. So, the consumption process, once the product is available with the consumer, how does he consume the product. So, that is of importance. And once the consumption has happened, once the consumer has used the product or starts using the products, interacts with the product, what are the ways in which consumers interact with the products. Now, once the consumer interacts with a product, uses a product, he ought to have positive or negative feeling about it, a positive satisfaction or dissatisfaction. So, then we focused on what are the positive, how consumer deals with the satisfaction with using a product when the product matches what he wants, and how does he deals with the dissatisfaction. So, once the product fails him in some way, how does he respond to that, and then how he moves from the product which is not working to the other product which is working. And so, this is the first part that we did in the last 18 lectures. Now, after these the process of understanding what a consumer behavior is and what is the decision process of the consumer, we moved on to certain psychological variables which is of interest. Now, since the course is on consumer psychology, we largely focused on psychological variables which affect the consumer transactions and the behavior of the consumer, the interactions of the consumer into the marketplace. So, we started off by looking at perceptions, which is a basic psychological process, and how does perceptions affect consumer behavior. So, we looked at all subject related factors, which is individual factors within the consumer, and stimulus related factors. And in addition to that, we looked at certain other kind of perceptions, social perceptions, price perceptions, cultural perceptions, and how these perceptions actually affect consumer behavior. Now, the meaning of perception is making organization, taking in information and organizing this information to a meaningful output is what perception is defined as. So, we looked at how inputs from various systems are organized into meaningful wholes and what is the meaning that is derived for it and the process of organizing this information, and that is perception. So, we not only looked at perception as per se, but we also looked at social perceptions, cultural perceptions, and so many other perception types, price perception, and how does this affect the behavior of the consumer. Then we looked at something called basic cognitive processes like learning, memory, and organization or categorization of information, and how these processes actually affect the behavior of consumer. So, we dwelled on to certain theories of memory and how these theories of memory affect the way consumer behaves in the marketplace. Then we looked at certain learning theories starting with instrumental classical conditioning and observational learning, and so many other theories, probabilistic theories, of how these theories are actually used by the consumer and the marketer to make the marketplace a better place, a place with consistent interactions, a place which supports what the consumer wants. Then we looked at processes of emotion and mood and how emotion and mood and consumer involvement affects the behavior of the consumer. So, both mood and emotion and consumer involvement and motivation are factors which are psychological in nature, and these factors are meant to affect the behavior of the consumer into the marketplace. So, we looked at several theories of consumer mood and consumer emotion, and we looked at how intrinsic and extrinsic motivations and various formats of motivation actually affect the perception or the behavior of the consumer into the marketplace. After that, we looked at a very important topic, which was attitude and attitude change. So, how is attitude formed? So, we in that particular class I defined the psychological variable of attitude, because attitude is a very important part of consumer behavior. Attitude defines how a consumer behaves. So, we discussed in detail what is attitude, the theories of attitude and the various forms of attitude change, starting with persuasion and not limiting to the idea of cognitive dissonance and indirect methods of attitude change. Now, why is it necessary? Because change of attitude itself is a feeling, way consumer thinks about products, and the change of attitude is very necessary for making the consumer choose products or do alternate evaluation into the marketplace. In consumer decision making, attitude change is an important factor, and most marketers are actually targeting attitude change. So, we looked at those theories and we looked at this attitude and attitude change in the context of consumer behavior in those classes. Now, in the last class we looked at something called communication effects, which is messages which are put on into the marketplace by the marketer, and how these messages are perceived and what are the factors these messages are controlled by, and how these messages affect the behavior of consumer, or rather change the attitude of the consumer into the marketplace. So, what role does various factors play? So, in the last lecture we looked at 4 different models of communication effects. So, briefly we will go through those models, and then what I will do is in this start with the present lecture, where we look at various factors which affect consumer behavior or the consumer attitude change or consumer interaction in the marketplace. So, we started off last lecture by looking at what is communication effects. So, briefly looking at what communication effects is, and so we looked at what is the basic response of these communication effects, and there we looked at the desired response of most communication effects is increased awareness, brand acceptance, brand preference, brand trial and brand adaptation. And then we looked at various different models of consumer effects, and we started off by discussing something called the hierarchy of effects model, which basically says that this model, what it proposes is that for a message or for a communication message market communication to be effective, it has to follow the steps of an AIDA model. And what is an AIDA model? An AIDA model says that most advertisements or marketing communication has to arouse interest, capture attention, invoke desire and lead to action, and the 4 steps any advertisement or a message has to do. Then we looked at a more complex model of hierarchy of effects, which is called the Steiner model, and in the Steiner model we looked at 5 stages of the Steiner model: awareness, acceptance, preference, buying intention and trial and purchase. And so, this is how the model looks like, and so this model where we discussed what are these factors and how these factors actually affect the behavior of the consumer or the interaction of the consumer into the marketplace. The next model of discussion was the integrated information response model. Now, this is a better model or a more comprehensive model of consumer message viewing or message acceptance. And what does this model really do? This is what the model looks like. It says how does the consumer, it explains how does the consumer perceives these messages, and based on these marketing messages how does he form commitment to the products. And so, there are 2 ways to this. So, as you can look at, this is called the information source, from where the information actually comes about. This is where the information actually comes about, and this is the marketing messages. Now, this information source has 2 ways of actually affecting the consumer. One way is a direct way, which is using the 5B pathway. So, a message is given to a consumer, the consumer accepts it, forms higher order beliefs and has higher order effect, gets higher order feeling. So, highly trusts the message and forms a positive attitude toward the message and leads to commitment. Another way in which consumers respond to marketing messages, if you have advertisements or any form of information which is passed on by the marketer and which is intended for the consumer, is through something called this particular pathway, which is the 2A pathway. And so, here what happens is an advertisement is given to consumers, and these consumers actually have very low belief about this and develops lower order belief and lower order effect, and then goes to trial. And once he tries the product, he forms a higher order belief, higher order effect, and then forms a commitment to the particular product. There is a third way in which the consumer forms lower order beliefs and lower order effect, and then tries the product, does not get satisfied with the product and actually goes on trying the product again and again. And so, that is what we discussed in the last class, these 3 or 4 different possibilities of this model. How does this really work? Then we discuss something called the extended dual mediation model, which basically what it says is that it dwells upon the fact that any advertisement leads to effect, emotional response, and this emotional response leads to a belief about the advertisement as well as the feeling about the advertisement, and the belief about the advertisement and the also reinforces the feeling about the advertisement. And this feeling about the advertisement or the attitude about the advertisement, because the feeling and the belief will form the attitude, this attitude about the advertisement will actually lead to the formation of cognitions about the brand. Now, most messages are about a product and a brand in detail, and so the cognition about the brand or the belief about the brand is influenced by the attitude about the ad and the cognition about the ad. And this cognition about the brand, cognition about the company which is manufacturing the product or for which the advertisement is there, that will lead to attitude about the brand, and this attitude about the brand is also influenced by the attitude about the advertisement, which finally leads to the purchase intention. So, if you remember from the last class, there is a way to define this, and we discussed this in the last class. And the last model that we discussed in the last class was elaboration likelihood model, which has 2 processes, the central route and the peripheral route, and central route are used for factual messages as well as peripheral routes are used for emotional messages. And so, we also looked at the various conditions, for example, motivation and ability, and how motivation and ability actually influences the message perception and behavior of consumer into the marketplace. So, these are things that we did into the last class. Now, starting in today's class, we will look at various factors which sort of define the behavior of the consumer, or which defines the effectiveness of the marketing communication. So, basically marketing communication can be of 2 or 3 forms. Marketing communication could be an advertisement, it could be a clerk in a retail store when he gives you some information, or it could be a salesperson in a showroom which is giving you any information. Or marketing communications can also be advertisements into the newspapers, or add columns, editorial columns or reviews into the newspaper. So, basically then marketing communication are these different formats. They use these different formats for passing on information about products to the desired consumers. And so, various factors actually affect the behavior of consumers. And so, briefly speaking, these communication effects, which is what is the effect of message or advertisement on the consumer behavior, and these the AIDA model and all that we have discussed, extended dual mediation model, all these models, or the revelation likelihood model, all these models are then influenced by various factors of the source which is creating the message itself, as well as the media which is creating the message. So, this particular communication effect with the effectiveness of any advertisement is dependent on something called the source which is creating the ad. So, source creating the ad has a influence on how the advertisement will be perceived by the consumers, and that will further lead to attitude formation of a positive or negative attitude, or lead to an attitude change which will further lead to the behavior of the consumer into the marketplace. Or these other factors are media factors. So, the media vehicle, how the communication message is passed on to people. So, it could be in terms of newspaper, it could be in terms of television, it could be in terms of so many other things. And so, it is the source factors, the media factors and the message factors itself. So, what is the message? And so, we will look into these 3 factors into this particular class. So, starting with source factors, what are the various factors the source which affects the effectiveness of any marketing communication. Now, 2 components, expertise and trustworthiness, are essential to source credibility. Now, when you see a message, when you see an advertisement, any advertisement has a source. Let it be a Patanjali advertisement about a toothpaste. Now, somebody comes in and explains that this is an herbal toothpaste. Now, the source which is creating the message, the person who is asking you to use Patanjali, that source itself, that the expertise of the person who is demonstrating or who is telling you to use the message, and the trustworthiness with that particular source has a lot of effect on source credibility. Now, people take source credibility very seriously. They actually verify the source who is creating. So, if there is a herbal toothpaste which is being promoted, a message for a herbal toothpaste, an advertisement for a herbal toothpaste, if Ramdev comes in, or somebody who is a herbal doctor, Ayurvedic doctor, he comes in and he explains to you how these toothpaste really work, then you trust it, and because you believe that this doctor who's a herbal doctor is an expert. Now, the expertise of the source. Now, if some random ABC comes in and tries to advertise the herbal toothpaste for you, you are not going to trust him, but you trust experts. And so, doctors, Ayurvedic doctors are experts, or yogis are experts in terms of herbal medicines, and so you trust them. And so, if Ramdev comes in and says that buy this herbal medicine, you believe from all the knowledge that you have about Ramdev or his or his Patanjali Yog Peeth, that they manufacture herbal products. So, what happens is that you believe that the source is an expert, and you also have trustworthiness in him, that increases trustworthiness. And so, for you, that source is, or that person is credible. So, Ramdev advertising for toothpaste or he's any other person from his yogpeeth, from the Patanjali yogpeeth in a particular way, if he advertises or a yogi advertises for the herbal products, or a herbal doctor advertises for a herbal product, you are going to trust him. But if an incompetent source is used, then people don't trust it. For example, let us say take any other ad. Let us say an ad for masala, right. So, or an ad for spices. Now, an ad for spices will be influenced by, or will be more promoted by, if somebody who is a chef actually advertises this masala, because chefs know more about spices, they use spices in their daily life, and they are more expert in that and more trustworthy than using Shah Rukh Khan into a ad for spices, because he is not an expert. And so, source credibility has a lot of effect, or a lot to say in terms of expertise and trustworthiness. Also, source credibility affects consumer persuasion through the process of internalization. So, why does it happens? It happens because people internalize this message. If an expert give a message, if tomorrow somebody who is an expert, a master chef, he goes and brings an ad, he comes in an ad and makes an advertisement for spices, and he says that use these spices because these spices, Tata Sampoon or whatever it is, use these spices because these spices has this flavor and this kind of organic compound, this kind of smell, and so on and so forth. You will trust it because you will internalize this message. You will take this message from a credible source and you will store it internally for the reference, because each time you think about that person, that master chef, this masala will come to your mind, and so you will buy it. And so, through the process of internalization, process of binding this source who is trustworthy and expert with the particular product which is advertising, binding them and internalizing them, thus effectiveness of source credibility plays in terms of an effective communication system. Another factor is which is a source related factor, which affects the perception of people, or which affects the behavior of people, or which affects the effectiveness of marketing communications or advertisement, is something called source credibility. How credible is the source? And so, perception of trust results from the use of low selling or soft sell tactics. So, how credible is the source? So, the credibility is influenced a lot by expertise and trustworthiness that we have seen. So, some of the perception of trust of sources or people who are demonstrating a message or explaining a message in an ad is dependent on the use of low selling or soft sell tactic. Now, if people use soft sell tactic, or sources use soft sell tactic, where they do not force you or do not some way hint that buy their product, but just gives you a reason enough to good reason enough, so that you consider using their product, that is called soft sell. If they do it that way, then people are more tend to buying that particular product. So, instead of saying buy my product, or instead of saying that my product is better than other product, use a soft sell tactic. An expert can use a soft sell tactic, saying that this can be a good option for you to buy, and this will solve all your potential problems, or satisfy the need that you have recognized, satisfy the need of the product that you want. And so, that is very important. Also, perception that salesperson is competent. If people believe that the salesperson who is selling them are competent enough, they have knowledge about the product. For example, if you go to a cloth store and the person who is selling you the clothes, if he has some knowledge about the cloth, various designs of the cloth, various kind of colors and shades and so of fabrics, then you trust that salesperson to be competitive, to be competitive enough, and you trust what he says, rather than on a salesperson who has no idea about clothes and standing in a cloth store. Also, perception that service is of high quality. When you go to a store and you believe that the store gives you high quality service in terms of consumer satisfaction, in terms of interactions, whether it is monetary interaction or personal interaction with the salesperson, or free goodies, or all kinds of things which are there. So, if you believe that the service is of high quality, that of the store, or any service is of high quality, maybe it is a car service, for example, a Maruti cell service, and so if you believe that it is a high service, when you give them a call, all they come to you and give you the good service, and if you believe that this kind of a service is of high quality, then you trust that source, then you trust that advertisement which is basically of Maruti saying that our service is of high quality or high grade service. And perception that car manufacturer cares about customers. So, in terms of since we are using car in the last example or in the last point and this point also, and so perception that car manufacturer cares about the car and about the consumers, that leads to more source credit. So, in terms of car industry, if you look at the car industry, if a company sells you a car, right, and so after buying the car, it also goes ahead and calls you several times, right, tries to make this personal interaction with you, offers you goodies, free services, some kind of interactions, or takes feedback. Now, if he does all these things, he will start thinking positively about the company, because the consumer, the action that the company is doing, the action that the particular showroom is doing or the service center is doing, is that it is trying to make long term reports with you or long term interactions with you, and that shows that it cares for its consumers. And so, in those cases, those sources which achieve any or most of these factors are known to be more credible sources. Another interesting factor is source attractiveness, how attractive a particular source is. Now, source attractiveness generally refers to the models which are working in a source, and it is believed that not at all times attractiveness of a source really works for a particular product. So, sources considered attractive by target audiences are more persuasive than those that are unattractive. So, those sources which are unattractive, those sources which are not looking good. So, models, female models or male models used in an advertisement, if they are very attractive, if they are appealing to the person who is watching the message, or very appealing to the audience or the market segment for which the ad is made, then people take it very seriously, and these people very seriously, and start liking them, liking the ad, and take whatever information is passed on from them to the people who is looking at the ad, and take these messages very seriously. Now, why does this happen? There are two types of factors here. One is identification with the actual self. Now, the thing is, if people find that the source, the model which is giving you information about the product, if the model is matching with your actual self, people take them more seriously, right. So, the more identification the particular model in an advertisement of a product shows to your actual self, the more highly this model is accepted. So, identification with actual self is when consumers identify with a source, seeing similarities between that source and the way they perceive themselves. So, if there is a garage advertisement and the advertisement is carried by a mechanic, or the advertisement in the advertisement you see a mechanic explaining why you should use this particular garage, or if it, let us say it is an advertisement of Castrol. Now, if it is an advertisement of Castrol, which is an oil or engine oil, a 4T 2T engine oil, and this advertisement highlights or it focuses, uses a garage mechanic to explain the benefits of using this oil, and this mechanic is in the usual form, he is not all dressed up, he is in his work clothes and with all blacks and everything, grease and all covered, and he explains to you why you should use this engine oil. And this ad is designed for those people who works in these companies, this service centers. Now, if a person who is a mechanic sees this mechanic, or a sales a service station manager sees the mechanic advertising for Castrol 4T oil, and then since he will be using Castrol 4T in his garage also, if he sees that and he finds himself to be closer to the mechanic closer to him, he will trust the mechanic based ad more than if some celebrity comes in and tries and explain to you why you should be using Castrol 4T oil or Castrol 2T oil in engines, right. So, the more you see, the more the mechanic for which the mechanics for which the ad of Castrol 40 is finds themselves closer to the person who's demonstrating the ad or who is acting in the ad, the better they will find that there is a match between their actual self and the person who is advertising, and the more close it is, the better they will perceive the message and they will trust it and buy it. The chances are purchase intention will be very high. Also, identification with ideal self is when consumers identify with sources seeing similarities between sources that they would like themselves to be. So, sometimes what happens is that people like to be something else, they have something different, something ideal, right. And so, people, for example, let us say those ads in which people want to be lose their weight. Now, if you show a gym ad with people with famous stars who have very well toned shaped body and they advertise a gym, then people form attachment with these people, these actors with very good bodies and body images or self images or very nicely curved bodies. The reason is that people who want to use gym and want to have these bodies, they see themselves closer to those actors or those performers into the advertisement which have well maintained body, and so they see themselves very close to the bodies that these people have, and so they are more likely to attach to their these actors. And because they see their ideal self very closer to the advertiser or the person who is in the acting, and so they trust the source more, and so source attractiveness are affected by both actual self and ideal self. Now, another important thing which is of importance here is source power. So, another variable is source power. Now, consumers perceive communication as having different type of source powers. Whenever a message is given, the most consumers think that or know that the source has some kind of a power or some kind of a way to control the message and the people looking at the message. The more the consumer believes that the source has power, some kind of power to change the way people see or to control the way people perceive these ads or act upon the messages of the ad, the more they are likely to fall in line with whatever the message is saying. For example, those ads which are given by police officials or hospital officials, doctors, lawyers, or those ads which comes from the income tax department. Now, those ads are taken very differently or taken in more matter of factly by people, because they believe that the income tax department has a lot of power, a lot of source power, and they can control the behavior of the people, they can control the actions of the people. Or police department ads which actually ask you to use driving preferences or use driving licenses or certain ways of driving rules and so on and so forth, because they believe that police department has a way to know how you act. And so, source power is another important thing. Now, there are three types of source powers that people are afraid of. Perceived control. Perceived control is that the consumer's perception that the source is able to administer rewards and or punishment if the consumer does not comply with the message demand. Now, if the person for whom the ad is made, if the consumers for whom the ad is made believe that the source has some kind of a control, for example, police departments or IT departments. Now, when they make an ad, the consumer believes that there are these companies or these ads and these people who have made the ads have a lot of control, right. And since they have a lot of control, they have a lot of perceived control, they can monitor the action and they can change the action of how the consumer is interacting with an ad. So, an ad comes in from income tax department saying that please pay the taxes by 30th of June. Now, these are taken very seriously and consumers act immediately, because they believe that if they do not act by 30th June, the income tax department will come knock on their houses and then take their money away or give them some kind of punishment. And so, this is the perceived control, because they believe that everybody is being watched, and that is why these ads come in this way saying that you are being watched. Another interesting factor that is of concern here is that perceived concern. In perceived concern, what the thing is that perceived concern is that consumers' perception that the source cares about whether or not the consumer complies. If the person knows that the perceived concern, if the source does not care whether the person actually replies or not, or whether the consumer actually acts in line with whatever the advertisement is saying, the more he is attracted towards, or more he is embedded towards, intended towards doing that action. So, in terms of doctors asking consumers to use a particular toothpaste and compare this with the case of an IT department ad. Now, in terms of doctors, advertising used to use a particular kind of a toothpaste for some kind of a teeth problem. Now, here the consumer believes that there is no concern as such, and the doctor actually does not care whether you are using the toothpaste or not. On the other hand, the IT department ad, which tells you to pay the money by 30th June, here the perceived concern is very high, because the source cares whether you pay the money or not. In those cases, the IT department ads, the consumer is more or highly has a high chance of interacting with that ad, or acting whatever the in lines with whatever the ad is requesting you to, then those ads which are given by doctors saying you to use a particular kind of a toothpaste for a particular kind of a dental problem. And then perceived scrutiny. Perceived scrutiny is the consumer's perception that sources is able to know whether the consumer has complied or not. The more scrutiny a particular source has, the more power of scrutiny a particular source has, the higher the consumer is the higher the chance that the consumer will act according to what the source is asking you. So, again looking at the IT ad, the IT department has a high chance or is a high perceived scrutiny, because it knows which consumers have filed and which consumers have not filed the taxes, and they can come after you. And so, they have high perceived scrutiny, and the consumers are more likely to respond to their ads, more likely to act according to what the ad is saying, then those ads by doctors or certain other lawyers or some kind of a source which has some kind of a power. For example, doctors have the power of healing you, and so those ads which comes from doctors saying that use this kind of a toothpaste, because they do not have that kind of a network, they do not have that kind of a facility to monitor each and every consumer if they are using the product or not. But the IT department ads or police department ads, which actually have the ability and the resources to monitor what you are doing after the ad has been displayed, those people should know that they have high perceived scrutiny, and they are more likely to act towards the act. Now, similar to source power, another important source factor is something called source congruity. And what is source congruity? Source congruity refers to the extent to which a celebrity who endorses a brand has a characteristic that matches the brand. Now, the more close a celebrity who is advertising a brand is towards the particular brand itself, the higher the chances that people will actually be reinforced. For example, let us say Clint Eastwood. Now, Clint Eastwood or Jean-Claude Van Damme is making an advertisement for a rugged pair of jeans. Now, the Jean-Claude Van Damme or Clint Eastwood has a rugged personality, and jeans are known to be rugged, and so they are more close together, and so Jean-Claude Van Damme advertising a jeans is taken more seriously, or Tom Cruise advertising adventure sports is taken more seriously than Leonardo DiCaprio coming in and making an ad for a rugged jeans, because it is taken as more of a romantic hero or a sweet kind of a hero who is not that rugged, right. And so, that is what is source congruity. The more congruent, the more close a source is to what is advertising, the more positively he is taken, or more positively people act to his message. Source congruity plays a major role in advertising persuasion when consumers are likely to elaborate on the advertised products. The more the consumers believe that the person is close to the product being advertised, the more highly they react to the message, and the higher the chances of the positive attitude being formed towards the brand, and the more higher the chances that a behavioral intention towards product purchase is formed, and the higher the product purchase. So, that is what is source credibility. The gender of a spokesperson or the announcer in a television commercial has impact on consumer perceptions or the effectiveness of the present. Also, who is advertising? The gender of the person who is advertising has a lot of role to play in terms of source congruity. Now, female products, if they are advertised by a male model, then they are not taken very seriously, but male products, if they are advertised by a female product, they are taken seriously. So, male products when they are advertised by both males and females, they are taken seriously, but female products are never taken very seriously by females when a male comes in and advertise this message. Also, the spokesperson, who is the spokesperson of a television commercial, that has a lot to do with who is the spokesperson. Females are known to be or believed to be a lot less credible than males in terms of source credibility, also in terms of trustworthiness also. And so, these are some of the factors, gender related factors, which actually show you what source factors affect marketing communications or the effectiveness of marketing communications. The second factor which we are which we will be dealing here is message factors. So, there are certain message factors that we will deal. So, as I said, we will deal with message factors, source factors and media factors. So, second is message factors. For example, message tone. What is the tone of the message? What is message tone? Message tone refers to the emotional versus factual appeal of a message. What is the appeal of the message? What is the content of the message? How is it appealing to consumers? Now, factual versus emotional appeals. Factual appeals are those appeals which actually have a lot of information about the product, which have factual information of the product. So, those ads which are of the nature which makes the consumer elaborate or dwell into information passed on by the message, those are factual message appeals. Now, so ads about let us say medicine, ads about tax paying companies, tax paying services, ads about banking, ads about things like let us say a new credit card. Now, all these messages, all these advertisements have a factual appeal, because the consumer have to process this cognitively, process this message, and this message have high risks and high benefits also. And so, they have factual appeal, because those messages has to give positive information or a lot of information, factual information, matter of fact information to the consumers. Now, if these facts are varied, if these facts are not true, the consumer will not take in the message positively and not act accordingly. But emotional appeal messages are those messages which appeal to the consumer on an emotional level, right. So, those ads which have attractive models coming in or use humor or some other form of emotional appeal to make the consumer understand the ad and not process it at a cognitive level are using emotional appeals. So, information containing ads are factual messages, and information ads or those ads which sort of bring out a positive or negative emotion onto you are emotional appeals. So, a lot of factors are there. For example, message processing. The message processing is another factor which affects the way an information or an ad affects the consumer, and so distraction is one factor. The more distracted a consumer is made, the more distractions are caused, the consumer is made. Factual messages actually negatively relate to distractions. More distractions are there, then factual messages do not work, but high distraction levels actually are more good, more pertinent for emotional appeals. Message pace, the pace with which a message is produced. Now, if a message is produced at a very high pace, if a message is given to you at a very high pace, if it is coming to you very in a very rapid form, then they are not perceived well by consumers. Also, factual messages should never be using a high message pace. Emotional messages can actually work with high pace. Product familiarity, the more familiar a product is, the better factual messages are, and so these factors actually really work for factual messages, and these are emotional, and so it works for most of it. So, the more familiar with a product that you are, the more factual messages work. But if you are unfamiliar with a product, if you are not very familiar with a product, then emotional appeals tend to work more. Also, priming. Priming is another factor which actually affects factual versus emotional appeals or demonstrate both of it. The higher the priming priming actually works for experts and not for novices, and so factual messages which are meant for experts, in those cases priming does not work. Now, in an advertisement, so there was an advertisement for car company. Now, they use something called priming. What they did was they presented different kind of cars and different kind of primes. So, each car was presented by a different prime. The prime was actually wallpaper. So, in one case the wallpaper was in terms of red color flames which are there in the background of the car, and in the and this was demonstrating safety features. On the other hand, the wallpaper was more of a cloudy kind of a thing, which was a blue color wallpaper, which was more cloudy in nature, and that was in the background of the car, which was influencing comfort of the car. Now, when these messages were shown to both experts and novices, experts did not look at the background, and so the priming, which the background which was somehow priming that this is what the car is influenced. So, a flame at the background of a car was actually telling that the car is more loaded with safety features, and cloud with a white blue kind of a cloud which demonstrated comfort, which at the background of the car was actually supporting comfort. And so, these background messages, these background wallpapers were noticed by novices, and they got influences. Experts which used factual appeals or factual messages, they did not get influenced by that kind of a thing. And so, this priming also tends to work for more for emotional messages than factual messages, but low levels of priming actually work for factual messages also. Now, there are different kind of emotional appeals also that can be used. Now, the different emotional appeals are, for example, fear appeals. Now, a lot of messages use fear appeals, right. So, remember the income tax ad, they use fear appeal. Their messages say that do this, if you do not do this, then what, by 30th June, 30th July or some certain date, what will happen is the income tax department is watching. And so, fear is another interesting thing that is to be used. A very simple matter of fact advertisement, where a doctor comes in and says that if you are not using this kind of a toothpaste, your teeth is going to rot out. So, Colgate ads or some other Sensodyne ads, which tells you that they use some kind of fear. Now, it has been found through research that moderate levels of fear are only going to work. Very low levels of fear do not work, and very high levels of fear do not work. If you put very high level of fear into the message, consumers actually pass this message, bypass this message, or they suppress this message. If a low level of fear is used, consumers do not recognize the fear. So, moderate level of fear actually work, and moderate level of fear actually work for emotional appeals. Humor appeals. Now, sometimes some messages actually use humor appeals. Now, remember the Vodafone Zuzu ad, what they do is they use humor as a message, as a method for putting forward the message that is there. Now, these Vodafone ads with Zuzus or any other ad which uses humor appeals, what they tend to do is they best work when the consumer is a little bit distracted and they are not very serious, and they work when the context in which the message is being perceived is more is not more organized, is more disorganized. So, humor appeals are also work for only intelligent people. So, people who can comprehend. If people cannot comprehend humorous appeal, they will just get stuck with the humor and not know about that. So, those people who watch Zuzu ads only for looking at Zuzu, for those people the humor appeal is not working. So, the humor appeal is good for those people who have certain level of knowledge, certain level of intellect. For most people who do not have these levels of intellect, the humor appeal is not working. Sex appeals. Now, it is known that nudity does not work in an advertisement, but moderate level of sensualness does really work. Also, female sensualness works more than male sensualness, and that is another thing. So, sex appeals do work, but it works for only those products which is sex related products, but for other products it is light sensuousness that actually works. With high level of nudity, people forget about the brand or the ad or the product which is in nudity, just concentrated on the models, and so the message does not work. Ego forces and other focused emotional appeals. So, there are two more kind of emotional appeals. Ego focused appeals are those appeals which are which actually embed in you, or which actually elite in you or lead to forming personal emotions like happiness, sadness. So, an appeal and an advertisement which actually embeds or which actually ignites happiness, sadness, fear or anger, that kind of emotion into you, are ego focused ads, and so they worked in a different way than other focused emotional appeals. For example, those messages which bring forth emotions like empathy, emotions like others concern, emotional like general well-being, peace, these kind of ads which bring out these kind of emotions or these kind of emotions in people are actually other focus appeals. And so both kind of appeals uses different kind of messages or are meant for different kind of different situations and different kind of products. Message context is another factor which affects the effectiveness of marketing communication. Message context includes any cues embedded into the message by the marketer. For example, background music, setting or location, and use of artifacts and furnishing. Music is another factor which is used by marketers for promoting their ad. Now, it has been known that if the music is only effective when people are not actually thinking of making a decision of buying the product. It works only when people are looking for making a positive attitude towards the product. If people are thinking of buying a product, or people are embedded in, or people are engulfed in making a decision about buying a product, their music does not work. Music only works to form a positive attitude toward the product. And so music is been used as a very general fact or a very general context for message effectiveness. Also, setting a location where the particular message is being made. For example, if a cold drink ad is made and that is made of a context is a desert context, it is more effective than a cold drink ad which is inside a cold freezer or near a cold near the North Pole. So, that is the message context. And the use of artifacts of furnishing. What kind of artifacts are used, what kind of furnishings are used, what kind of background is used in a message also has a role to play in the effectiveness of marketing communication. So, music works through classical conditioning by encouraging consumers to associate positive feelings aroused by the music with the advertised product. But the only thing is that if consumers are deciding at the time when the music is being played, then it does not work. So, how does it work? It works by classical conditioning. You feel good about the music, and this feeling good passed on or gets passed on to the advertisement or the product advertisement which is being made. Message execution. Another interesting thing or another interesting fact, psychological fact which works in terms of message factors and how these relate to the effectiveness of marketing communication is message execution. Message execution is the combination of strategies through which the message is implanted. So, how is the message actually implemented? How is the message actually related or unfolds? That is what is message execution. Now, use of implicit and explicit conclusions. Now, at times messages use implicit conclusions, at times messages use explicit conclusion. Now, if a message says that at the end of an advertisement, if the advertisement says that buy my product, it is using explicit conclusions, but if a product leaves the decision on the consumers of buying it or not, or the message is made in such a way that all the bad and good points of the particular product is advertised, good points of course very highly and bad points to a lesser degree, and the message of or the decision of buying the product or interacting with the product is left with the consumer. In those cases, the consumer are more likely to like the message than if it is explicit conclusions. Subtle persuasion and consumer involvement. If subtle persuasion is used, then implicit messages are very effective than explicit conclusions. And consumer involvement, the more involved the consumer is, the highly implicit message execution will work than explicit conclusions. The more involved the consumer is, in those cases explicit conclusion turns out to be counterintuitive. The reason is that if a consumer is more involved and you ask them to buy a product, they will have counter arguments about why I should buy the product. But if a subtle implicit way is used with more involved consumers, then they are more likely to buy the product and actually understand the ad and get the information from the ad and think about buying the product or form an attitude about it and lead to purchase intention, which leads to final buying. Self-reference messages speak directly to the consumer. So, those messages in which messages are made in such a way that it refers to the consumer in some way, it refers to the consumer's personality in some way, those messages are taken or they speak directly to the consumer, and they have high chances of being recognized by the consumer, understood by the consumer, and are being more effective than non self-expressive message. Also use of factual versus evaluative information. If factual information is given, then people are more likely to look at that ad positively than evaluative information, because for an evaluative information where people have to evaluate the message or to somehow rate on the message or understand the message or do something about it and then evaluate the message, those kinds of ads taken in rather negatively than factual messages, where the facts about the product which is being advertised are present onto the message. So, that is message execution related factors. Comparative messages. Now, comparative messages are those messages where two products are compared side by side. So, remember all those ads of Surf which says that Surf works better than something else, or Lysol ads which says that Lysol in comparison with phenyl, Lysol kills 99% germs, phenyl does not, that kind of a thing, or Meri shirt teri shirt se safed kaise. So, all those kind of ads are comparative ads. Now, a comparative ad message is one in which a product is compared directly with the competing product in terms of more product features. As I said, two products are taken in side by side and they are compared. One product is compared directly to all the product benefits with the other product. Now, when does this work? Now, generally speaking, these comparative messages do not generally work and it falls on the face most of the time, but there are times when these comparative messages actually work. The message use factual rather than evaluative information. If messages use factual information, gives you the fact why my product is better than others, then people take this comparative messaging or comparative messages as more effectively and are more prone to reading it than if they are using evaluative messages. Also, promoting a new rather than established brand. If a new brand is promoted, in those cases people look for comparative, or people perceive comparative messaging positively than when an established brand is compared. Third, the message is communicated through credible rather than non-credible sources. A credible source actually does this comparative messaging. If a doctor says use my brand of toothpaste and not the other brand, then people take it more positively than if some hero heroine comes in and says this different messages. Also, comparative messages really work when the message, the product owner who makes the advertisement, if he is not the market leader, right. So, in those cases, if a market leader does this, then it is going to fall flat on his face. If a non-market leader makes a comparative ad and compares his ad or compares his product with a market leader and says that I am second in number, or gives enough reason to people saying that if A is not available, the market leader is not available, my product gives you enough gives you enough reasons why you should stick to it, then people actually perceive it positively. Also, message evidence is information that substantial claims. So, message evidence is also another important factor which substantiates the claims and which shows the effectiveness of comparative messages. Mystery advertising is another thing that is used or that is of importance. Now, mystery advertising can be effective in enhancing brand awareness by producing a strong association in memory between a brand and a product. So, those kind of ads where a mystery is created behind an ad, and an ad is made in such a way so that a mystery is created, some part of the ad is given, the other part of the ad is given, or a mystery behind the use of the message or the advertisement is created. In those messages, a strong brand awareness is produced by a strong association in the memory between brand and product. The mystery creates the novelty, mysteries and novelties, and these are ways of actually improving memory. So, more the mystery is created behind an ad, the higher the chances of people associating this product with the mystery, and higher the chance of retaining them and considering the product in their retrieval set of memory. The message narratives are also used a number of times for communications more persuasive than others. Now, if your narrative is there, if a story behind an ad is there and the story somehow is made in such a way that it has some kind of an appeal to people, then those kind of messages are remembered more, because stories are made a gist. Most stories actually lead to the formation of gist, and this gist actually gets related to the product information or about the product. And so, this kind of an if you give a long story, then this people will go into this story, or they will see this story and they get attracted to the story, and that leads to this message narrative leads to the acceptance of the message and the the information which is passed on from the message. Now, we tend to organize information in memory better in narrative than other forms of use, and this information is more effective to make judgments than decisions. This is what I have been saying, that the reason is this gist formation, which is the reason behind why narratives are better. Media factors. Now, the third factor that influences ad, or that influences the effectiveness of ad, is different kind of media factors. Now, effective selection depends upon understanding the target consumers and their media habits. Now, what kind of media should be used for projecting the ad is also important. For example, should be used television, radio, magazines, newspaper, billboards, transit advertising, direct mail, telemarketing, in-store advertisement. For example, if the ad is of let us say some kind of spices or some kind of kitchen products. Now, those kind of products should be advertised more on television and radio, because housewives, the people who actually are looking forward for spices or kitchen products, are more related to televisions and radios and magazines than newspapers, billboards and transit advertisement or direct mail, telemarketing and in-store advertisement, right. So, in-store advertisement is another thing. So, depending on what kind of product is the positioning of the product, and what kind of people are we looking forward for, what kind of people are we dedicating the ad to, will decide which of these which has been used. For example, there was a study where it was found out that television as a media should be used for those people who are more staying in home, who are for the older age and who have a lesser level of intellect. If you have lesser level of intellect, television advertisements are better. Now, in comparison to that, newspaper ads are good for those people or who have higher level of intellect, and matter of factly ads should always be put on television or newspapers than on televisions, and so on and so forth. So, depending on the type of consumer that I am looking on to, depending on time of the ad that I am looking on to, and the product that I am looking on to, one of these media categories are actually used, and internet is another one which is of interest here. Now, there is a media subcategory also. Within the media also there is a subcategory. For example, if I am making a television ad, should the ad be made for a romantic versus non-romantic? So, should the ad come in before a movie or national news or sports or so on and so forth. So, each media category is made up of several subcategories. There are many syndicate sources of research information on general media audiences, and in some cases audiences for specific media vehicles or subcategories. For example, different kind of people, for example, people who are more attracted to more movies, a different kind of ad should be made than people who are attracted to more towards sports. And so, depending on what media subcategory is being used, a different kind of ad should be made, or different kind of media should be used. Media vehicle. So, media vehicle may be selected based on the reach and the maximum exposure that is provided for the target audience. Where do you want to reach? Whom do you want to reach? Who is your market? Who is your target audience? What is the segmentation? And those factors define the reach and what is the kind of exposure that you are looking for. So, the maximum exposure to the target audience depends on the reach of the media vehicle. Also, vehicles may also be selected based on editorial content. What is the editorial content? So, if the editorial content is of emotional appeal, if the editorial content is not the matter of factly kind of a thing, not very explicit, not very intelligent, then a different kind of vehicle is used than if it is of highly intellectual content. So, those editorial contents, those messages which are highly intellectual in nature, for that newspapers, magazines are used. But if it is a non so important fact, or the message contains editorial content which is not that intellectual, then a radio or a television can be used, or internet can also be used. Now, the marketer wants to control the content in which the message is received, because the context also has a lot of role to play, and so the marketer is interested in controlling the context in which the message was is received by people. Frequency is another factor. So, the frequency of an advertisement is the number of times consumer are potentially exposed to it. So, how many times the ads are made? Advertisers must realize that what is purchased is potential exposed. So, the potential exposure is dependent on how many times the ad is being placed. Now, still getting exposure is the key, because the progress is made without it. So, if the frequency is very high, then people will start avoiding an ad. So, what is the actual frequency that should be there of a particular ad? Now, frequency in terms of number of repetitions, in terms of television ads, but in terms of editorial content, how long the ad should be, how big the ad should be. These are two things. So, if we have a newspaper ad, the frequency will directly relate to the length of the ad. But if we have a television ad, the time of the ad. So, generally speaking, for television ad it is 30 seconds, and half a paragraph of ad is very good for newspapers. That is the guideline which has been set by most marketers. Message duration and size. What is the relationship between message size and the print advertisement and the duration of television or radio commercials and their impact on consumers? There is a lot of relationship. The higher the message size is, the in a print advertisement, the more distracted people become and they do not perceive the message rightly, they do not look at the message rightly. Similarly, if a ad is more than 30 seconds in a television, then people do not take it very positively. Of course, when the first time an ad comes in, a 1 or 2 minute ad is there, but then generally you see that this 2 minute ad is cut down across repetitions and made to 30-second ads. Consumer research findings have been contradictory because it depends upon message to message and ad to ad and people to people. So, these are some of the factors that we deal with in terms of message communication. So, a lot of factors that we dealt today. We started off by looking at source related factors, where we dealt with source power, source credibility, then things like source congruity and these factors, and source attractiveness. So, a lot of factors: source attractiveness, source credibility, source power and source congruity. All these factors actually define the source who is behind the ad, who is creating the message. And so, how these factors actually affect the communication, marketing communication, or makes a effective marketing communication. Similarly, we looked at message factors, different message factors, for example, message tone, the kind of appeal that we are using, the content of the message, and the execution of how the message is put forward in or executed in the natural sense, and use of comparative messages and so on and so forth. How these different factors actually define how a message should be or what a message should be, and the effectiveness of the marketing communication. Similarly, we looked at media factors, different kind of media factors, sub factors, and media vehicle and frequency as different variables, and media message size and duration. So, the length of the message, the type the message is produced, the kind of message which is there, whether it is factual versus non-factual, what is the media which is carrying it, and what are the context in which it is being presented, and so these are the factors which affect the communication or the type of advertisements, type of message communication into the marketplace. Now, what we did in today's class is that we continued on from the last lecture, where we looked at what is message communication, and we defined message communication through different models. Now, in this particular lecture, we looked at different factors, source factors and message factors and media factors, and how these factors actually change or actually increases the effectiveness of the messages or decreases the effectiveness of the messages. So, how in addition to how the message is created, in addition to how the message is perceived by the consumer, how the behavior of the consumer is changed by the factors, by several message factors, as well as content factors of the message, as well as media factors, as well as source factors, how they affect the behavior of the consumer or affect the transaction of the consumer into the marketplace. Now, because what is the bottom line of it? The bottom line of it is that a well informed consumer is actually more prone to taking or forming positive attitudes or change in attitudes about particular product or products or brands, and that leads to his final commitment towards the brand, which with a better commitment, the higher the higher chance of purchase intention is developed, which leads to final purchase. So, the more informed a consumer is, the better informed a consumer is, the better an ad is, the more informative an ad is, the more effective an ad is, the more learned the consumer will be, the more information the consumer will have, and the better the chances of him making a perfect decision, or making a good decision, or making a positive attitude towards a product or product group. So, this is the last lecture in this series of lectures in the course on consumer psychology, and what we did was, over these whole 19 lectures, we looked at different factors. Now, in the next lecture that we will do is a review lecture, where what I will do is I will look at all the lectures that we have done, and we will summarize. I will try to summarize all these lectures in one particular lecture and go over the course content and link the course in some way. So, for now, from here it is. Thank you.